We just heard Charred Remains from the, quite fantastic Autopsy from the Severed Survival record from 1989. This is the Requiem Metal Podcast. I am Mark.
And I am Jason. And we decided to elect this record into, I guess, our not so terribly elite or even well thought out Requiem Hall of Fame that we sort of put on. But decided to do an album focus on Severed Survival rather than Mental Funeral, which tends to get I don't know, more attention. I mean, they're both pretty lauded albums. I don't think Severed Survival gets totally slighted as a shit record or anything, but it's more of a
the first two I think get way more clout than Acts of the Unspeakable or something, which is
Shit Fun
Shit Fun, which is basically
the first Abscess,
an Abscess record. It's Urine Junkies Part 1 or something.
But it's this is different people have different experiences, I think, with Autopsy. Certainly Mark and I were kind of chatting about this before. This is a band that in America went somewhat, I guess, unrespected for a long time, at least when they came out, because they didn't fit with the normal late 80s, kind of death metal scene. They weren't part of the Florida thing. They were California, so they had a different kind of more laid-back attitude, I guess, about them in terms of their musical approach, at least from the outside. People thought maybe they were lazy or something, which they're not at all.
They're stoners, or if they were, but, that doesn't necessarily make you lazy.
And so these guys had almost more of an influence outside of America than they did in, and we've talked certainly about that before when we featured Autopsy on our
Crucial Years.
They were on the most crucial year of all time, 1989.
That's right.
And we played a song from Severed Survival, of course. So that's always kind of been a weird thing about these guys. They never broke like Morbid Angel and Obituary or Death or any of those bands, even though they have clear associations with at least Death, a direct descendancy from there. So for me, when I was growing up, because of the fact that their albums were on Peaceville, which meant that kind of once they cycled through the initial record shops, they weren't restocked the Morbid Angels.
They're all imports up until
the mid-90s
or something.
So I never was able to really access Autopsy for a long time, and so this is kind of a band I discovered, I guess, late in the game in terms of the late 90s, and for you and Chris,
it was probably Mental Funeral era. It's probably when we first started hearing about them, at least, because we're getting stuff for the Requiem fanzine at the time, getting serviced. Probably more likely Acts of the Unspeakable era. Mm-hmm. But by that time, we were so entrenched in Swedish death metal and stuff that was not necessarily spit and polish, but musicality and recording was so different than what Autopsy was doing, which, on Severed Survival, it's very analog in the sense that it sounds like it was all recorded in a room at the same time. It has a totally different sound than anything recording-wise that was coming out at the time. So we kind of, I think, just generally threw them in the whole category of the Cannibal Corpses and Suffocations and guttural death metal, and we listened to them a little bit, but it really wasn't on the radar that much. And until
even with Dismember and Entomb talking about them and name checking them a little bit, it didn't really pique your interest.
I think there's such a sour taste in our mouth from the our first kind of initial thing, especially when you go and look at Peaceville. What else they had on the label? They were kind of a weird anomaly at that point. Having Dark Thrones and Paradise Lost. And,
in hindsight, it makes sense. So
it totally makes sense because they
was sort of hip to something different that Autopsy was doing, or something more European almost. Yeah,
because they didn't fit in any category. Like a lot of the bands that that were on Peaceville didn't fit in a specific niche. Mm-hmm. So I didn't really get back into Autopsy until when did the first Murder Squad record come out?
It's 98 or 99, I think. Was it right around the time from Torn from the Grave?
Because they had two different ones. It might have been 97 or something.
Okay.
Because I went back and kind of re-explore them again. Got into them a little bit more, but in hindsight, I'm kicking myself in the ass that I didn't listen to them all along.
Yeah.
It seems really weird, but
I mean, it's almost like I could find myself listening to Autopsy more than I can a lot of those old, I guess, quote unquote classic records from that era. I don't.
Oh, like Cannibal Corpse or that kind of stuff. Ugh.
And I love Corpse and Obituary, but there's I just don't put them on like I used to. Those are more like teenage records for me or something now, whereas like Autopsy seems like almost, even though like lyrically, like there's nothing advanced happen. It's just it's more of like a classic like punk grind record that just like ages a little bit better than
every time, because I think a lot of the stuff that we didn't hear when it came out, I'm almost glad, because I think I appreciate it more, and I'm hearing all the subtleties and stuff that's happening in it more so than than back in the day. And just this thing, I think it almost has a timeless kind of sound to the thing, because there's all these weird doom elements. There's all this like proto-Swedish death metal stuff. And, the demo that came out right before Severed Survival, I know, was heavily traded back and forth between, like Nicky Anderson talks about in the Decibel Hall of Fame for Metal Funeral, about how those demos and this record was so instrumental in Entombed, and you can definitely tell the guitar tone. Mm-hmm. You don't necessarily hear so much on Charred Remains, but some of the later on songs you'll hear really that kind of like Swedish Sunlight Studios sound guitar is on this. The leads,
well, even like I was pointing out to you that the vocally I hear a lot of Chris Reiferd's vocal of like influence on some of the almost oversung style that LG. How hard LG pushes with his vocals, especially like on Left Hand Path and Clandestine. Yeah. I hear a lot of that, like right in Charred Remains and stuff. Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. But I guess that Entombed style, that kind of, was brought from that. And then I think, too, just the oddity that, I mean, how many death metal bands in America were, like, bringing, like, this sort of grimy punk vibe to them, outside of like Terrorizer, but they were almost like more part of the grind scene with punk influences rather than thrown into the death metal scene, even though they shared members and stuff.
Yeah, because like Autopsy's punk influence.
But again, Terrorizer, a California band, so again, sort of
totally different vibe. I think that punk influence comes more through their feel than necessarily direct influence from like hardcore or anything. Because at the point of recording this stuff, those guys weren't listening to any punk or hardcore at all. But then later on, like, I think like I hear stuff punk, like I think I wrote for like in Critical Madness, a song we'll hear later, like I hear punk in the same way that I hear punk in like early Death Crush from Mayhem. Mm-hmm. It's like it's not they're not like doing like Sex Pistols covers or what I mean. There's nothing like direct descendancy, but it's that kind of riff that a novice would come up with. That goes right back to punk rock.
And maybe it's like, coming more of the crusty, grindy influences that came out of Autopsy, or came influence Autopsy. Like you mentioned Genocide, early Repulsion. Being like a big kind of impetus for these guys. So
really one of the only kind of, I guess, extreme metal acts outside of like Slayer is an obvious influence in a lot of things, but a lot of it goes back to like like rock, Sabbath stuff.
Big
Trouble,
St. Vitus,
and stuff like that.
And you hear a lot of that. You know, I mean, what you heard on Charred Remains there. I mean, you've got like almost this template that's like it's like Death Leprosy, Death Scream Bloody Gore, which would make sense because the main guy, and I guess maybe we should tell you who's on this record before we go any further, but the main guy, the guy writing the lyrics and playing drums and singing is Chris Reiferd, who was of course on Scream Bloody Gore, the sort of infamous Death debut in 1987. Then
the Genocide connection or the Repulsion connection is that Scott Carlson and Matt Olivia went to play with Death. Very short, for a very short period of time as well.
And on bass, well, I guess we'll go to the core band, then we'll mention who the guest.
Eric Cutler was the guitar player that him and Chris Reiferd formed the band in '88, and then later on, Danny Corrales came on in the second demo, I think, and then Steve DiGiorgio, which everybody should know, played only on this record.
Steve DiGiorgio is one of those guys. He's like Garm or something, or Tonelli Jarvo, where we could do a Steve DiGiorgio show pretty easily in terms of all the like random things he's been on, between Sadist, Testament, all the death stuff. I feel like he's been on way more than just that, and I'm drawing a blank all of a sudden.
Was he in the Charred Walls of the Damned? Or
He's in Charred Walls of the Damned. So
Yeah.
and then this Autopsy. So there's a serviceable amount of things.
He's almost like Danny Lochner or something. Where
Yeah,
he could, do a show like that.
And speaking of which, it's interesting on Charred Remains, like the swirling. I wrote swirling doomy grind bass that you hear, especially in the middle of Charred Remains, is like so templatey for what Brutal Truth is going to be all about, which is essentially like a stoner grind kind of thing, which is, I guess, I don't know if that's a really horrible genre term, but it's whatever.
Well, they were like the after Terrorizer kind of like jumped the bar again on grindcore. I think that Brutal Truth record, Extreme Conditions, is the next big step. In that genre for sure.
So, Danny Lochner, of course, is the bass player for Brutal Truth. So I'm sure this record,
Nuclear Assault,
Autopsy,
the Ravenous, who would later play with.
Well, and
Reaver.
Danny Lochner is playing with these guys now, right? Or at least he played with them live.
Now they've got another bass player that I forget his name, but on the new record, the Macabre Eternal that came out. Oh, it's not out yet. It should be out in a couple months, I think. But that's their first record in like 16 years or something.
Yeah. Well, and they had the oh my gosh, the EP that I picked up.
Tomb Within.
Tomb Within.
Yeah.
Is Lochner on that? I feel like he might be.
I don't know.
I'll need to check. Or maybe I'll check.
But yeah, because then I think in 2000, because that came out. Did that come out in 08?
The Tomb Within?
Yeah.
No, that came out right after we saw them live this last summer.
Oh, that's right. Because 08
Baltimore.
they put out a 7-inch. They had 2 new songs, and that kind of spurred
Brought them back.
this whole EP, and then the next record. The new record's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, I've heard
good.
little bits and pieces of it. So, but the record itself, and getting DiGiorgio was such an oddball choice, I think, and that's maybe for some people one of the controversial choices on this record, because DiGiorgio is coming out of being this very technical, finger picking bass player who did a lot of things that really was foundational for, I think, what Chuck attempted to do with like individual thought patterns and even like Human and things like that. Even though he's not on Human, he's part of that like thinking man's progressive metal,
bringing like more I guess, but not classical, but
musicality.
Just bringing really really good musicians into this, because I mean eventually I think most people that started out doing death metal were really novice musicians, but that just the music itself, given the kind of construction and speed and all that stuff, all these guys become fantastic musicians eventually. And I think that's one thing that Autopsy was always kind of overlooked at, is being a bunch of like meathead, throwing them in the same kind of like the Cannibal Corpse brutal death metal thing, which they're not at all. The vocals aren't even guttural. Like nothing, they don't really sound like anybody, but yet they kind of like influence this entire next generation of death metal. And
you look at the subtleties of besides what DiGiorgio can do from a technical level, but even like the drumming subtleties that Reifert, who's probably thought, if you hear his stuff on Scream Bloody Gore, there's nothing that like,
it's pretty caveman.
It's pretty brutalic, but he does a lot of really cool things throughout this record, a lot of swinging kind of moments, which we picked up on, and we'll talk about when we get to like Ridden with Disease and stuff. But just really subtle, kind of cymbal work and things like that as well. He doesn't even really go to the blast beat that often.
No, he actually,
if ever.
He throws one in a little bit live, he said, but he never wanted to learn how to do it because he didn't like how it sounded. Yeah, and
plus it'd be exhausting to probably play blast and sing.
And the way he plays pretty cavemanish. He's hitting the kit pretty hard. And, playing drums. I've played drums off and on for almost 10 years, and listening to this record, it almost reminds me of when I first started playing, you could only play fast for so long, and then you had to break to something slow. Mm-hmm. And it almost a lot of the kind of vibe of this record seems like it's some of it's kind of constructed based on their limitations as musicians. Yeah. But they use it to their advantage. They're not trying to just like, well, I can only play for 15 seconds, do a blast, so we're only going to do like a 30-second song. Yeah. Like, well, let's add some doom stuff. We like Sabbath, I don't know if this is the thought process, but that was just kind of like what I was thinking when, listening to this thing 3 or 4 times today.
I can kind of hear that, and I mean, and then lyrically, what you're getting is just pure, like, I mean, almost some of the most essential, like, gore lyrics ever written.
Yeah, and it's all coming out of, a lot of it's coming out of like Fulci and Italian horror and the Beyond, and just they were basically like smoking a lot of pot, drinking a lot, watching really extreme horror movies. Yeah. And it makes sense at that age. You don't know the there's nothing really that deep. It's all some kind of like gut instinct of why you want to play this stuff, you know?
Yeah. But I also think that you shouldn't throw them in the same category as the Cannibal Corpses and the Obituaries and stuff like that, because I think they're coming in a totally different approach by bringing in, like in Charred Remains, like near the end of that song, you get this like very much Saint Vitus, like hopeless, like pit of despair kind of riff that's like,
yeah, I think like the depth to their music, it comes like the emotions that you pull out of the riffs and the solos and stuff, like that's where the emotion is, and that's where the honesty is at. It's not in the lyrics, that's just surface. I
think. And and the fact that so much of it has like a grimy, especially like the way that DiGiorgio's bass like almost like counteracts a lot of what's going on, and how he kind of sometimes weaves in really well with what Reefer's doing on the drums, creates this like grimy, punky rhythm section at times.
And it keeps it always like, propelling forward. It's never like, even if it's a really, really doomy kind of slow riff, there's always that kind of like nudging forward.
Yeah.
It's never just sitting still.
I feel like it's almost, and they don't list these guys as an influence, but I doubt they would ignore these guys. But I feel like it's kind of like what you hear with the Stooges or MC5 in terms of the way that those rhythm sections were so bombastic, but yet pretty technical.
Well, the rhythm sections of Stooges was the best part of the band.
Yeah, always
musically
forward moving. Like I mean, it was there. And yet the music was sort of chaotic and maybe even lazy, especially for the Stooges. But yet the emotions there, the honesty's there. The nihilism sort of there, and I think Autopsy was like kind of the American death metal equivalent of that, and that's why I would put them in
the same kind of regard. I mean, if you look at how many punk bands were influenced by the Stooges, how many death metal bands were influenced by Autopsy?
Yeah, it's like,
and in the same
an entire continent by one band, you know, which is incredible to think of. The Dismembers, the Entombs, I mean,
Unleashed,
all those bands.
Paradise Lost was there's in that Decibel Hall of Fame. Nick Holmes talks about how he got a test pressing of Separate Survival from Hammy at Peaceville,
and the tones and stuff
and he's like, this is like still one of my prized possessions. Like I'd never ever get rid of this thing.
Yeah, and
just with how like cross genre they were, it was just. Sure. I don't think it was one of those bands that I don't think America was ready for. It didn't fit into anything.
Well, certainly you and Chris were on your own way.
And even though we're jumping from Dark Throne to Paradise Lost At the Gates, all that stuff made sense. But Autopsy it had a little bit of the familiar from the kind of brutal death metal, the Florida death metal stuff. But then all this other stuff, we just didn't know what to do with it.
It probably from your perspective at that point, maybe it was like not. So it wasn't like novelty enough for you because it was American.
Well, that was one of the things is the American bands are always kind of second tier in our opinion, because the stuff from like, what did you ever know about Sweden? Especially in the late 80s, early 90s, all you knew is like IKEA, like Volvo, that kind of, like you knew
Vikings,
like you didn't know anything about music industry outside of like ABBA or something. Like there was that kind of, discovering new stuff and this, this foreign thing that we really wanted to kind of discover.
Well, it's interesting because it kind of ties in a sense philosophically with, as some of you loyal listeners know, I've been teaching this rock and roll history class, and we were talking about, Hard Day's Night and Beatlemania and the whole British invasion and how unique that was to America in a sense that the fascination with a foreign culture, and that American audiences digested blues through British bands that were bringing it back to America almost because they were more willing to listen with an open ear, partially for racial reasons and then partially because it was like this exotic foreign thing, so
absolutely.
When like the Rolling Stones and the Animals and the Yardbirds came and Cream and some of that stuff came over with like sort of the white blues rocky kind of stuff and brought it back to America, people were responding to that, whereas like in Muddy Waters and those guys were like cheered as heroes over in England because they were this exotic kind of thing.
That's how like jazz was in like in Germany and France and stuff too. Like these guys that were destitute in the States were treated like kings overseas.
Well, there's that story about, I think it was it wasn't Charles Lloyd,
Gilmore.
No, not John Gilmore from Sun Ra. It's escaping me. If I think about it, I'll tell you. But he was a jazz musician in New York who played homeless, or was mostly a homeless guy, but he would play on street corners and things like that.
Wasn't that Gale?
Charles Gale.
Charles Gale, yeah.
Did you say Gilmore?
I said Gilmore and then Gale.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, because I was just picturing the CD.
I was thinking of Gilmore Gale. Yeah, it was Charles Gale. Yeah,
Okay.
not Charles Lloyd. I think he was a bass player for Eric Dolphy or something. But Charles Gale would play like on the street corners in New York and stuff like that as like a homeless guy, and then like every year and a half or whatever, somebody would find him and say, hey, we booked a European tour for you. And he'd go on a plane and he'd arrive in Europe to like a crowd of like hundreds of people like cheering him on, getting his autograph, and it's just
unreal. It's
such a bizarre way of treating art and some
grass is always greener,
Yeah, I guess. And Autopsy's that band, I guess, and so and you mentioned the influence on even the non sort of Swedish death metal kind of stuff. Like the next song we're going to hear, Service for a Vacant Coffin, like the opening riff is almost Cathedral before Cathedral even existed. It's like 1989, so it's a year before Forest even comes out.
We had, like Candlemass and Winter and stuff like that. Well, Winter, I think came out in 89 as well.
Yep, yeah.
But, you had the Doom stuff, but it didn't have the same kind of like bludgeoning power that this did.
Yeah.
Like it did the death metal even more extreme, and it did the Doom elements more so than anybody did up until, I don't know, a handful of years ago. Like you can even hear the kind of Doom they're doing now is like something that Hooded Menace does.
That's very much a place that they're kind of like sludgy death metal or something like that.
Yeah.
That's one of the ways to describe these guys. I mean, I guess why if there's people out there listening, why would we pick this over Mental Funeral?
Personally, I think the songwriting's better. I think there's that kind of like youthful vigor that like they had to prove themselves. I mean, they were in, Chris was in Death, which, it had a huge underground following at that point. And then I think just that kind of like, teenage, well, they're probably in their early 20s at this point, but there's that naivete and then, having to prove yourself and like starting your own thing from scratch. You've always got that kind of like energy out of the gate. And for me, Mental Funeral is a little bit more, the recording's not that great. It's a little sludgy.
Yeah.
The riffs aren't quite as dynamic. Like every single song on this, it just propels into the next. And if you'll, as you're listening to the record or to the rest of the show, at the last, like between a minute and 40-second mark on every song, that's when the solo goes off. So it almost
with a minute remaining.
Yeah. And it just kind of like blows through like these couple trade-offs between Cutler and Corrales. Just these solos that basically throw you right into the next song.
Yeah.
There's no letting up, but it's not the kind of bludgeoning like a Suffocation record, which I enjoy a lot now.
Yeah, it's not beating the shit out of you.
But those records are purely kind of like almost testosterone filled, and this stuff is just it's a little bit more just kind of like weird and off kilter.
Well, it's coming out of like places like you said, like the Pentagram, the Saint Vitus. I mean, even like King Crimson, like 70s stuff, like because it is Lark's Tongue.
It's kind of proggy if you really break this stuff down.
Yeah,
it's proggy, but it's not
sloppy prog. Yeah, it's like really sloppy, organic kind of prog stuff.
Find that quote.
Oh, the quote from Reeford about
he said he'd rather have soul than perfection. Like they want it to be dirty, raw, just like filthy sounding. Sure. And that comes through in the recording. I think the recording, the songwriting, everything on this
unfortunately
Mental Funeral for me.
Well, and unfortunately you said that the original like version of this was not mastered very well.
The bass was higher in the mix, which I like the bass,
probably.
But from what I can kind of remember, I think I remember,
because you've imprinted the new one on your brains.
I think it kind of like nullified some of the guitars where it pushed it down a little bit. So basically you just hear at the very ends of the songs, you hear this like flurry of solos. But before that, I think it was just the whole dynamic range is kind of deadened in that original release.
Yeah, and so like that's one of the coolest parts about these reissues is, I guess I never had to hear it the wrong way.
And it's one of the few times there's actually a remaster that does anything outside of boost the volume levels.
Yeah, yeah. The vast. I mean, I'd be curious to see how many bands were really listening to these guys, because the next song that we're going to kind of get into here in a second, Service for a Vacant Coffin, like I mentioned, not just Cathedral, but the whole like song is playing around in this like Black Sabbath riff, but it's like mirrored in like this sludginess, and I would almost like say that it's almost an influence on like the kind of approach like I Hate God and Crowbar and some of the like the swamp like New Orleans stuff kind of took. But, you know, like, I can't prove that they were listening to Autopsy, but certainly judging by what I know from Phil and some of those guys, they weren't, like, adverse to, like, extreme metal. You know, I mean, they were certainly very open to that. And I'm sure being stoners and all the other things, they'd probably be like, this is some sick shit. And the fact that they're all, like, Fulci obsessed, too. Yeah, you know, exactly. They might be really obsessed with what Autopsy was doing, so...
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I think that probably turned people off to Autopsy was the association with the gore, because I mean the covers are pretty over the top, and then the logo. I mean the logo is a bunch of organs hanging together, and you know, and entrails and all this like eviscerated shit, and it's I mean it's not what I would expect to hear given the cover.
Yeah. That's true.
Like listening to a Cannibal Corpse record, that's what I expected to get. I expected to get pummeled and have some good hooks. Yeah. And this is just completely. I mean, it's like throwing on a jazz record or something without having any preconceived notion of what it is.
Yeah.
Like, oh, there's this black dude in the cover holding a saxophone. And then you hear an Albert Eiler record, and you're like, this is like unbelievable,
crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this cover got banned, correct?
Yeah, I don't know if it was in the States or if it was in the UK, because at the UK at that time, there's that whole like indecency thing, like where, you know, Carcass was getting shit about the, you know, Symphonies of Sickness and covers and all that kind of stuff. So, but the censored cover, I think I like better.
Yeah, me too.
I think it's Kev Walters.
That's Kev Walker.
Yeah. Walker. He did. God, I still can't remember.
Warhammer in 2000 AD.
2000 AD. That's right. The kind of anthology comic magazine from the UK, but you know, it's basically just a bunch of like zombie surgeons, like, you know, the POV as if you're on the operating table. You know? It's a pretty sweet cover.
It's cool. It's a neat cover. That's the cover I'm more familiar with, because whenever I used to see it, you know, in people's collections, it was that one, not the original cover with the hanging organs and the meat hooks and all this.
The guy basically being like, you know, drawn and
torn apart, basically. Yeah, just torn into pieces, which is cool, you know. But yeah, so let's check out a set of music that's going to feature, for me, my personal favorite, and I think your personal favorite's coming up in the next set, so it's kind of nice. But we already mentioned Service for Vacant Coffin. I mean, you know, feel free, you know, if there's like, you know, I mentioned the Cathedral stuff and then the Black Sabbath riff that you'll hear kind of lingering throughout. I mean
it's almost you know, the whole funeral doom kind of genre that kind of popped up in the last 5 or 6 years.
Yeah,
that whole kind of like dirge feeling. I totally get that out of this song.
Yeah, and that's weird to go from a song that's like coming so obviously like Charred Remains. It's just like pure energy,
pretty straight ahead, to
something like this, and then you kind of go.
The whole rest of the record is almost kind of a balancing act.
Yeah, it kind of goes back and forth. You know, Disembowel is one of my favorite tunes as well. I think it's maybe the best feature of like showing Steve DiGiorgio's bass interplaying throughout. You know, in such a swampy technical death metal song, to be able to hear bass was like incredible. You know, let alone hear technical bass. You know,
exactly.
So I think that you hear in Disembowel like a really quintessential Swedish death metal tone.
This is where you first start the kind of breakdown or the dropout or whatever, where the drums, everything drops out. That's almost exactly the Sunlight Studio sound. Mm-hmm. I mean.
And I don't know, is that why they were like pulling out the Boss pedal and stuff like that? Were they trying to get the Autopsy tone, or were they just fucking around with stuff?
I haven't really heard any kind of anecdotes to say anything about that, but this predated, you know, Nihilist was doing those riffs at the time, but they did not have the guitar tone until Left Hand Path came around.
Yeah.
So I don't know because I mean, at this point they were tape trading. Who knows? Like, hey, what kind of guitar pedal?
It was so incestuous at that point. You know, who can pinpoint at the exact moment?
But you just hear that. You hear some of the tremolo riffing starting to pop out in this too. That you know, the Entomb and Dismember would end up, you know, really kind of like perfecting.
Yeah. And then we'll end with a couple of tunes that I probably want to talk a little bit more about, which is Gasping for Air and Ridden with Disease, and maybe we'll talk about those when we come back.
Yeah.
So we got Service for Vacant Coffin, Disembowel, Gasping for Air, and my personal favorite, Ridden with Disease. Ridden with Disease, Gasping for Air, Disembowel, and Service for a Vacant Coffin. All family-friendly songs for your amusement.
Good times.
That 1-2 punch of Gasping for Air and Ridden for Disease that we sort of end it with, I like wrote down some things. Like Gasping for Air is a song that's always sort of jumped out to me, I think, mainly because of the end. The Eric Cutler lead at the end is one of the more incredible moments, I think, on the record. It's very... You and I were talking. It has like a Symphonies of Sickness, kind of like that same,
just this flurry of notes.
Flurry. I mean, it's beautiful, yet it's just like chaos. Like it's like you like chaos is flying all over you, and you like grabbed it and you have it in your possession for a second. And like
it's like, okay, well, you got 15 seconds. Wow me with the solo.
Yeah,
and like this is one of the few bands, I don't think we really talked about this before, where it's almost like more of a rock blues based solo, which it was not the Slayer dive bomb stuff. It wasn't like
that's coming out of the Sabbath, Trouble, Vitus camp, which was more
but just like
rock
more notes.
Oh yeah, okay, I get what you're saying.
But like Iomi would be like would just they had like this flurry, but this had like that kind of extreme metal edge back on top of it.
Like Slayer via Sabbath,
and you can hear this. Left Hand Path, all the solos sound like they could be Autopsy solos.
Yeah,
they're not quite as like as manic as the Autopsy ones are, and even the ones that were on Dismember, like an Ever Flowing Stream, which Nicky Anderson wrote most of those. That's kind of the same thing.
Sure.
So I think like Dismember and Entombed are just they're kind of like the stepchildren of Autopsy.
Yeah.
They kind of like the torchbearers overseas for them.
Mm-hmm. And even like Gasping for Air, which has like a Celtic Frost like riff in it, it's not Obituary like Celtic Frost. It's like gloomier than like what Obituary was able to do.
Because Obituary had great guitar tone, and they used really really few notes on every single song. But sometimes it just kind of like bled. Like you almost had to listen for the decay
for
to hear any kind of variation. But Autopsy seemed to figure out how to like really get those. There's really like minor chords where you could do 2 or 3 notes and hold it out and do a bend, and it felt like it was you just saw your family slaughtered or something, like really emotional kind of stuff. Where it hits you, like really hits you at the core.
Well, and speaking of emotional, Gasping for Air, like it sort of resonates off, and then in my opinion, I think you backed me up, and I think a lot of people out there might. One of the most quintessential death metal riffs of all time just comes in with Ridden with Disease.
Well, and I think this is. We talked about this a little bit pre-show in our pre-chat, that the whole first 4 songs until we get to Ridden with Disease, it's almost like a prelude to that riff. You hear little bits of it in those first 4 tracks.
Yep, that seems to be like the magic moment of the record in terms of like everything coming together.
It's almost like put it in like jazz terms, like the coda of the record, where it's like this theme that you allude to, and then you hit them over the head with it.
It's just right there. Yeah, and you've got the explosive solos that play off sort of the Death Leprosy vibe, but then doomier textures to those solos. Reifert cymbal work, especially near the middle. There's that middle breakdown where we said it sounds like Pull the Plug meets like Entombed Crawl.
It's the Entombed Crawl riff.
Yeah,
it totally is.
Swings and swings. And Reifert's like cymbal work was, I thought, really influential on some of the ways that like Nicky Anderson would drum, especially in Left Hand Path. His whole approach to the kit was that.
Because because it was a weird Entombed and Dismember. I think both are a weird mix of this kind of like Repulsion and Autopsy meets D-beat hardcore crust, anarcho punk kind of stuff.
Yeah, and, although. And you'll get into
as far as the drumming
moment. Dismember was more probably rooted in what Autopsy was than even Entombed was to some extent.
I think Dismember were more rooted in Autopsy was than Autopsy was.
Yeah.
Dismember is more, especially like later on.
They like Autopsy.
Yeah.
Almost.
And actually, one of the songs we're going to...
Well, the next song we're going to hear actually,
Pagan Savior, which is on the Dismembered an EP, I think right before the Death Metal record came out, called Misanthropic. And it's got
oddly enough, I had Misanthropic, but I didn't own death metal for years.
The problem with that is I had, because we were both working at the same record store, I never bought it for some weird reason. Every time it came in used, somebody that didn't really care but wanted to try out death metal got it.
I didn't get death metal until the radio station.
I didn't get it until 2 years ago.
Really? That's funny.
Yeah. I don't know for whatever reason, but...
anyway, sorry.
But the Misanthropic EP had Pagan Savior on it, and I wasn't familiar enough with Autopsy to like by name to know that song. And I was just like, man, this song is fantastic. And reading the liner notes, I was like, this is an Autopsy song. But it's so dismembered. I think Pagan Savior is the template that it is basically Dismember's entire discography boiled down in that one song.
Yeah. And it's that riff that come in kind of near the middle, right? It's kind of in a breakdown. I mean, it's just that
that kind of like not arpeggio, but just it's quite a simple riff, but to where because Dismember used this in like all of their kind
iconic,
all their kind of like epic songs, know. So
yeah,
and this is one of my favorite Autopsy songs as well.
Yeah, it's a cool tune. I think Ridden for Disease and Pagan Savior are kind of the 1-2 punch of the middle part of the record. And sometimes middle parts of records can kind of sag, but to me, it's like they really did set this up and construct it in such a way that it's all building towards these kind of tunes. Yeah. And then you come out of it,
because they get over the hump, and then it's just, I mean, the whole record's like, shit, it's over already. I mean, it's like, it's almost a Rain and Blood length.
Yeah.
8 minutes longer or something.
Sure.
But
and then you come out of that, and we're going to hear Impending Dread, which, I mean, the name says it all. I wrote, it has one of the most oppressively doomy openings that I've like, it's just grim to all hell. And then it sort of rolls into like kind of a really cool groove-laden riff that is just littered with like sort of King Crimson Red moments and stuff. It's a weird, I don't know, like to know that Reifert's favorite 2 drumming influences were Dave Lombardo and
Keith Moon.
It's just
which I can hear the Keith Moon more than I hear the Lombardo.
Sure, the sort of caveman barbarism kind of.
But I hear a lot of Bill Ward too, because he loves to do roles.
Bill Ward,
Bill Ward's a caveman, but he does, and Bill Ward was and similar, I think, to
he could
Reefer.
Swing too.
He could do that, Ward. But he also he was never playing on time. He would play with Iommi along with him. So it was basically he's playing by feel and not by like click track kind of sound.
Jonas Catatonia style.
Exactly.
Like never in time.
Yeah. Which you try to ever cover, end time. That song is off.
Good luck.
Yeah.
Good luck. And then we got 2 more after that, Severed Survival and Critical Madness. And I guess Severed Survival being the title track, we'll mention it just for a moment before we go to some tunage. Really cool organic quality. I mean, you mentioned it. This is a record that sounds like it was recorded like all live at the same time.
Yeah.
And this is a perfect sort of song for that. Later, Opeth and other bands will sort of grab these kind of moments on metal songs, but too often in the Morris Sound Studio era, which was all about perfection and all these sort of things, you never would have heard a song open up with like the sound of like finger slides on a guitar, almost like they're making mistakes or something.
You can hear, it's like jazz, you can hear the valves of the saxophone, or you can hear the hitting the drum on the rim of the kit or whatever. And Reefer goes on the record of saying that they wanted to sound basically like 70s stuff, but anything away from Morrison, because they thought it completely like sterilized death metal, which going back and in retrospect it totally did. It was a factory kind of system to where like, okay, Obituary and Death and some of these other bands kind of like perfected the sound.
Sure.
And then everybody
could appreciate
wanted
the technical quality of how crisp it sounds, and
for that era to try to actually accurately capture death metal, which was not easy. I think Autopsy did it better.
Sure.
Straight out.
Yeah, in terms of the ethos of what death metal is, the sloppiness,
having it organic, having it heavier than shit, having it really visceral, and this and having the solos just like be like eruptive.
And, things like that.
As far as like a sonic spectrum goes, the Autopsy Severed Survival is like tops in my opinion.
It's kind of like comparing rock records. It's like, Stooges Funhouse has this like over the top visceralness that really I think captures the ethos of what rock and roll is supposed to be.
Yeah.
And it doesn't take away from like say something like Pet Sounds or Sgt. Pepper or Revolver or something, which is such a well crafted, like very nothing's made by mistake on that record. It's almost like pulled together and orchestrated, and that's like the Morris Sound kind of version of death metal. Yeah. In that it's very like like meticulously put together and perfect. And that's like those are essential rock and roll records too. But you don't listen to them in the same way that you would listen to like a Guns A-Blazing Funhouse record or something like that. Yeah. Because that's just like it's you can't contain the energy on that record. And it's the organic feel of that too. And I think Autopsy is that too, more sound stuff.
And this has kind of always been my preference, but I've always preferred the more organic sounding, not perfect stuff. So this stuff, especially like kind of rediscovering this stuff even more later on, is really like gets me super stoked.
Sure.
Just that, to have the feeling of it is what really matters to me. It's not that you can play in, like the new Obscure record is great, and but that's not like a go-to thing for me. And like now, like rediscovering a lot of this anarcho-punk stuff too, which is recorded terribly, but the energy and the enthusiasm is just like so huge that it kind of like supersedes all that.
And the only thing at this time I could even, and I throw this in the same thing. I would throw Severed Survival in with Altars of Madness, because I think Altars of Madness from Morbid is like it has that funhouse quality where it's almost like you can't contain it. Like
nothing sounds like that record.
Pete's flying off, Trey is out of control. Everybody's totally out of control in that record. And that's why I think I've always had such a rough time. Not a rough time, because I like Blessed of the Sick, don't get me wrong, but I know there's some diehard Blessed of the Sick people, but I don't want to say it's sterilized, because it's not. But Altars of Madness has an energy that they'll never tap into again. It's just part of that, and I feel like Severed Survival is that kind of record as well.
I think Blessed there's a little bit of, youthful arrogance with doing these like transitional classical pieces, which you can never reproduce live. Yeah. And it kind of kills the energy out of the thing.
It's more Pet Sounds. It's more like craft it. And that's fine.
Or like My Bloody Valentine Loveless or something, where it's you're using the studio to full effect kind of thing.
And there's nothing wrong with it. It's just, depends on, apples or oranges or whatever you prefer at the time.
But then, having those kind of like, the difference between Altars of Madness and Severed Survival, it was so great to have that kind of like variation of sonic quality of Extremities, because they don't sound anything alike. No, it's in the same genre.
Exactly. So we got Pagan Savior, Impending Dread, Severed Survival, and then we'll end this set with Critical Madness. Critical Madness, Severed Survival, Impending Dread, and Pagan Savior.
That's right. The only
Pagan
kind.
Savior. That seems. I guess that's not an oxymoronic statement. If it was Atheist Savior, then it would be an oxymoronic term.
Well, an Atheist Savior could be finding that exactly
Science.
Humanist Savior.
Yeah, there you go.
That's the thing that you don't see often in autopsy stuff is
religion.
Any kind of religious
social commentary
stuff, but they like stuff that was evil.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Pagan Savior.
Pagan's a good word. I mean, that's just a great title.
Sure. Well, and Pagans did human sacrifice, which fits with Autopsy's basic theme of gore. So
yeah, exactly.
Makes sense all the way. But Critical Madness, the song we just heard, that's got like a real Trouble, Vitus, Pentagram kind of doomy opening, and you and I were kind of correlating. Like, I heard a lot of Asphyx. Asphyx is another band that was very informed, I think, by that. That's just that death doom kind of tone,
Because Autopsy almost picked up like all of those kind of the Celtic Frosts and the Hellhammers and those really kind of simplified, or not even simple, but the very kind of simple, very they had their own like unique identity.
Yeah, and they could hold a note for a while.
They picked up all that stuff like kind of as they're rolling along, but it was never blatant.
Yeah.
And so I think this is like the next kind of like they're almost like channeling all that the Possessed and all that stuff from the early '80s into this next generation, and then dump it into Sweden, and then they just go to town on it.
Yeah. And that's what's kind of interesting. Oh, and Critical Madness, that's the song I wanted to mention that has the Mayhem Death Crush kind of feel to it, like near the middle, like very much a total punk. Or
it's pretty raucous,
yeah, kind of a punk rock thrash kind of thing at the end. That's where the sort of genocide, napalm, grindy moments kind of start coming in a little bit.
Yeah.
So, but that's about all she wrote on this record. We've got one more to play, but
really, I think
final thoughts on Severed Survival, Mark?
If you don't own Severed Survival, I think that's at this point now. If somebody was like, okay, I want to know, tell me 5 records that I need to have
that connect to like everything,
or just that I want to get into extreme metal from a historical standpoint. Give me 5 records.
It'd be interesting,
and this would be on it for sure. This, Left Hand Path, Altars of Madness. Then those other 2, I'd probably go Repulsion, Horrified.
I might go Leprosy at that point.
So I mean, I think it's in that kind of company. It's in those kind of peers that. It's an incredibly underrated record. The musicians are underrated. The guys, people thought of them as just kind of throwaway dirt bags, but I think this is probably one of the most important records in death metal.
I mean, where else, like with the title track we just heard a second ago? I mean, where else are you going to get like a doom meets speed metal riff right before like you hear the guy scream amputation? Amputation.
It's like, it's so bizarre.
It's weird. You go from this like Slayer riffs to Trouble riffs to like, I mean, it's like Dream Death is a band I'm kind of into, and they're definitely not the death part of it so much, but they have some death doomy kind of moments.
They were one of those transitional bands.
Yeah, but it's like I can't think of any other bands that were doing. Winter was doing this, but they were like more
so different.
Crust, oppressive, apocalyptic doom with deathy moments, but nobody had the energy that what this record sort of has until you get
the production quality,
Left Hand Path, and like an Ever Flowing Stream.
Because I think this record actually captures what they were trying to do better than any record up to that point.
Yeah,
and it was probably on accident.
Yeah, total accident.
Like the Napalm stuff was rough. Death stuff was recorded pretty roughly. Like nothing really captured. I think it goes Severed Survival and then Left Hand Path is the next kind of genesis to capture that guitar tone that nobody could really, that elusive guitar tone.
Yeah, and who would have known bringing in DiGiorgio would have added such an odd mix. And I don't know if we really stated this, but you said that it always felt like didn't you say the guitars seemed to you like they were always gonna like sort of fly out of control, but DiGiorgio like
it's like
fighting them back,
like a dog on a leash. Like the DiGiorgio is almost the leash that as soon as the dog goes out just a little bit too far, it pulls it back in.
Yeah, he's like winding it with this
constant kind of ebb and flow, and keeps the energy going constantly.
Yeah. And you don't hear that very often. You barely hear bass. You barely hear bass in death metal.
Did you ever hear bass in Metallica or like most thrash? Yeah. Not really that much.
Yeah.
So it was like basically this record now. If I would have heard this with fresh ears and open mind as a kid, it would change my life.
The production that you hear on it now.
The remaster makes a world of difference on a thing. But this is definitely a record everybody should go out or buy the digital download or go to Blogspot or whatever you kids do nowadays. But I would prefer you give money to Peaceville because they put out great reissues constantly.
Yeah. And if you do like this record, and I'm sure down the road we'll look at some of the other Autopsy stuff, but like what I started with was the Torn from the Grave collection, which is
a good collection,
nice little collection from all their records and EPs and stuff. But certainly Mental Funeral and Acts of Unspeakable are great.
They're great cheap. They've all been reissued. They have all the EPs put on it and bonus tracks.
And they should be touring very soon. And they were pretty awesome live.
They were fantastic live. That was another reason I didn't probably like or get into them as much because they didn't tour. Yeah. Because they were basically broken up by the time I was really headlong into the stuff. And could get to Detroit to see shows.
And I'm sure when this new record comes out, I think it will get some attention. I won't give the secret away, but it is going to be Indecibel, and it got a very favorable review. Yeah. I think they're a band due for a renaissance almost. Yeah, like a renaissance of appreciation.
Well, if any of these other bands have any indication, the Seances and who else?
Unanimated.
These bands that have had these kind of 10 to 15 year hiatuses come back. I mean, like bands like Paradise Lost who have had slumps and ebbs and whatever in their career, coming back and everybody kind of gets it.
Yeah.
So I think it's this great time for guys like us who've been in the scene forever, getting our kind of tentpole bands coming back and doing great records again.
For sure.
Instead of the just over the top technicality crap that I can get into it at some point, but I'm thinking of like the Cattle Decapitations and these kind of just ridiculous bands. Like go back to the roots. This is. The new Autopsy record is kind of like a smack in the head to kids that got too overambitious. Like, this is what death metal's supposed to be.
Yeah,
so.
Absolutely. Good. Well said. Let's end with that. So we got Embalm that we're going to be kind of heading out on, kind of more American sounding at times, kind of Cannibal Corpse-y, but a good kind of closing number.
It's got a good lead. Every song had a good lead toward the end.
Great Eric lead on this one, Eric Cutler lead. Let us know what you thought. We didn't. This is the first episode in quite a while we haven't had an executive producer credit for. And I think people out there who are listening to this episode are going to be sad that they didn't produce this.
They're going to be kicking themselves in the ass.
So get on the horn with that. We've got some neat things kind of coming up. We might even do a comparison episode with a record that's also near and dear to Autopsy and things.
We're going to do a record that wouldn't exist without this record.
Yeah.
But if for people out there that don't know what the executive producership is, if this is your first episode for some reason, executive producership is anyone anyone who donates the most through you go to requiempodcast.com. You can click on the donation link, and if you are the one with the highest donation of that week, you will be the executive producer of the show. You get your name, your thanks right on the show. You get your name in the show notes, and this is something that these are evergreen shows. People go back and listen. Every week I look at the stats, and we always have at least, almost every single episode out of the 120 some we have right now get downloaded. So this is something constant. And if you have a website or some kind of presence that you want plugged, we will plug it. That link will be in the show notes for eternity. So as long as the world exists.
Yeah. So as Mark said, check us out, requiempodcast@gmail.com, or send us an email at requiempodcast@gmail.com, or check us out at requiempodcast.com. Where you can also get some merch, different things.
I'm going to be doing some new merch.
Yeah. Cool.
So
some updating just in time for Maryland Metal Fest, so you can get your gear and then come find us if you.
That'd be great.
It'll be like, where's Waldo? Where's Mark and Jason?
I'll buy you a beer if you're wearing some kind of Requiem stuff.
Shit! Now
some Requiem
we're
gear.
gonna have like 40.
If we have, it'd be fantastic if we have a lot, but I doubt that'll happen. If we have like one or two, that would be fantastic.
That'd be really cool. Yeah.
And even if you don't, if you like the show,
just find a dude. Hello.
Yeah,
come and say hello.
You'll find us.
You'll see us. We're usually not in the pit.
Not unless it's Autopsy.
Yeah, and then we'll be like front row or like in front of the pit sometimes. But
I might be in the pit for Doom. Who knows?
Yeah, maybe. Ghost, I might go crazy for those guys.
I think people are just going to be sitting in awe.
Yeah, they're just going to be kind of standing.
So
you'll be snapping photos of Ghost probably.
Absolutely.
So, but leave us a rating on iTunes. Check us out on Facebook page, Mark and Jason, and So hopefully you enjoyed your venture into Severed Survival. And for Requiem Metal Podcast, I'm Jason.
And I'm Mark.
And here's Embalmed.